week, we come to the resumed debate on the motion on the introduction of the 2019 loan charge.
Because Justin Madders had finished.
Yes. Justin Madders had just concluded his oration when the debate was suspended last Thursday, something I'm sure all colleagues recall very keenly. And therefore, I think I'm right in saying that the next person to speak in this debate is Mr. Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker, for being called so early in this resumed debate. I have to say I had never imagined I was going to speak in this debate, seeing as rain kind of stopped play about this time last week. And I am by no means an expert on the loan charge. But I, like many others who expressed an opinion last week, have been contacted by numerous constituents who have been setting out in clear terms how they believe that the loan charge, the 2019 loan charge, would impact on them. And they are being asked to pay back thousands, tens of thousands, indeed, in some cases, even hundreds of thousands of pounds that they never believed would be due. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe that everyone should pay their fair share of tax. We know that that's what funds our public services, and we should clamp down on tax evasion at every possible opportunity. But minimising tax exposure has always been a legitimate part of our tax system. So, when looking at this, I have been on a journey. Initially, I was in two minds about the validity of the arguments that were presented. Obviously, I had great sympathy for my constituents, both on a personal and an individual level. But I felt that the old adage is of, if something looks too good to be true, it is too good to be true, applied here. But now I have come to a different conclusion. I have looked at the individual cases presented and at the wider issues. And to demonstrate why I have come to that conclusion, I want to use the words and the sentiments of one particular constituent has sent me. Now, he wants me to do this anonymously, as he does not want to prejudice himself or his case. And as an aside, I am not sure it's a healthy state of affairs where constituents are scared to speak out against a government agency. Now, in my example, my constituent is a freelance IT professional who was advised to enter one of these schemes. So when he entered the scheme, to give himself confidence that it was legally compliant and that what he was being told by his professional advisor was true, he contacted HMRC. And the correspondence my constituent has from HMRC shows that in 2012, when he was checking for compliance under DOTAS legislation, that's the disclosure of tax avoidance schemes, he asked HMRC to review the particular arrangements he had joined. And I'm informed that HMRC Anti-Avoidance Group concluded that no hallmarks of tax avoidance were in evidence. And so HMRC did not assign a DOTAS scheme number to that arrangement. Now, if that's true, which I obviously believe it is, I think it is fair to say that under HMRC's duty of care and due diligence, they had plenty of opportunity to inform my constituent that things had changed and that the particular arrangement that he had entered into would be liable for taxation. But HMRC have completely failed to notify my constituent that anything was amiss. So for years, he relied on the initial HMRC advice he had received and continued as a customer of the arrangement.
Friend, give way on that very point.
Of course.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and that is what concerns a number of my constituents, is the retrospective nature of this and the disproportionate approach being taken by HMRC. The people I represent are very reasonable. They would be happy to come to an arrangement with the HMRC, but the HMRC seems to want to bankrupt its debtors as opposed to get some return from them.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend from Broxbourne makes an excellent point. All the correspondence I have had have been phrased in very reasonable terms. They want to do the right thing, but they feel under a huge amount of pressure. Of course.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Taking on your example that my honourable friend is using, fundamentally, HMRC every year, I'm sure your constituent, sent in a tax return. And that tax return went in, and HMRC ticked it and sent it back or whatever and approved it. And actually, only until recently has HMRC suddenly they've seen the way things are going and said, right, this is some kind of tax avoidance, let's get it all back, and in 1 year, and in 1 year.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't know what the rules are about an honourable member reading over my shoulder the next line in my speech, because what it says here is that he continued with these arrangements and he dutifully declared each and every year on his tax return the amount he had received in loans and returned the amounts thereof. So it came as a surprise when years later HMRC now attempts to use its newly granted powers in what he describes as winding back the clock to retrospectively claim the arrangements my constituent and others had used was not legal, had never worked, and that the tax on the loans was always due. Of course.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way and for the excellent points he's making. Does he also find, like me, that he has several constituents who had no option to be employed on a self-employed status and that they were required to enter these kinds of vehicles?
The honourable lady makes an excellent point, and yes, for many there was no option. On this particular occasion, and I'm sure many others, will have had to enter these schemes. In the example I'm giving, they even checked whether or not there were alternative options and checked the legitimacy of it, never thinking this was going to come back and haunt them. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have to say I don't like it. It feels wrong. And I have to say, often when I'm a fairly reasonable chap, I like to think, that when I feel something is wrong, is off, it doesn't feel like natural justice, it tends to be true. And eventually the government will come round to my way of thinking, or I very much hope so. Now, as I said, I am not an expert on tax in general, but the very retrospective nature of the charge, the failure of HMRC to notify scheme users of the tax liability, the fact that users sought professional advice or advised to enter these schemes, and in this case of my constituent that I am quoting, annually declared what he was doing. So, in failing to act back in 2012, when of course.
Thank you very much, ever so kind, for giving way. Does my honourable friend agree that for some caught up in the loan charge situation, that their circumstances may be the result of unfortunate omission, for example in professional advice or indeed HMRC advice, rather than deliberate commission on their part, and for that very reason clemency and reasonableness should be applied by HMRC?
I think my honourable friend makes a very excellent point, entirely standing on its own rights, and I hope that it will have been listened to. Now, as I said, I'm not an expert. I'm conscious of giving way, but yes, of course.
On that point about some latitude, does he agree with me that looking at these cases, they do vary quite considerably, and that in some cases it may be allowing more time to pay? Other cases it's looking at the detail of the debt and whether there is other evidence to suggest that it should be less. And in some cases, it's a question of giving some latitude on how many years you go back.
Thank you. I think the points that are being made are very good. I am aware that the government has laid out some of the mitigating measures that it wants to put into place, and I'm sure that we all welcome those. But there is, I think, a need for both a pause and a full and proper review of what is being proposed to see whether or not we are acting in a way that would be considered to be natural justice. So if I can carry on. So in failing to act back in 2012, when it had the opportunity and surely the duty to do so, HMRC denied my constituent the opportunity to depart the arrangements and seek an alternative solution for his payroll needs.
Been so generous in giving way, I almost hesitate to intervene once again. But when he says that something feels wrong, I think he's onto something. Because what feels wrong, I think, to some of us is that this equivalent effort does not seem to be put into pursuing the promoters of these schemes, or indeed the employers themselves, and that the entire weight of this of recovering this so-called tax gap is falling only on the employees. That doesn't seem to feel right.
Just before the honourable gentleman answers that point, I should explain to the House that we have less than 50 minutes left for this debate, for obvious reasons, and the honourable gentleman for South Basildon and East Thurrock finds himself in the difficult position of being the opening speaker, as it were, and therefore he's being required to take a lot of interventions because people have short points they want to make. But of course, this debate did have the bulk of its time last week, and I know from what people have told me that what they actually want to hear is the Minister's reply to the many questions that were asked last week and will be asked this week. There will therefore be a very short time limit on speeches, probably 2 minutes. The honourable gentleman for South Basildon and East Thurrock has been very generous in taking interventions, and I'm sure he wants to finish the points that he would like to make. I have no objection to him taking further interventions as long as the House realises that that will be the bulk of the debate. Mr Metcalfe.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I hear what you say loud and clear, but I did want to allow members to intervene because I think it allows them to get their points on the record. So I just want to reiterate, my constituents, the point my honourable friend made is very valid, and I think that we need to be looking at a wider net of where we recover some of this money from. But I want to reiterate, my constituent only did this under advice from a chartered accountant with Tax Council's opinion. So while, as I have said, everyone has a duty to pay the tax they owe, this does feel off. It feels like a retrospective tax grab. And we know that this is causing great stress, anxiety, depression. We know that there have been 3 suicides associated with this. So it can't be right, and surely that we must have a duty to look at this again. Very simply, and I want to quote my constituent, if I may, very simply, if the loan charge is not delayed, and comes in as it is, it will destroy my quality of life and that of my family. It may well prevent me from working and lead me into bankruptcy. It has already caused me to suffer extreme stress and is causing huge anxiety for my family. If the government ploughs on with this retrospective legislation, it will be responsible for devastating the lives of families across generations. So, I want to leave that point there. So, can I ask, therefore, the Minister to consider seriously a delay in implementation, a removal of the retrospective nature of the charge, certainly not going back further than 2017 when the charges were first announced, and hope that the assurances he has already given members who have written to him, and I'm very, as I said, grateful for those reassurances, that he will be able to build on that, find other mitigating measures so that we can demonstrate as a House and that we can respond in a positive way, and that we are capable of not only listening to but hearing and acting upon the people who come to us asking for our representation.
There will be an immediate time limit of 3 minutes. Ruth George.